What's up, everybody? I'm Mnar Adley, founder and director of MintPress News. Welcome to our official podcast for MintPress News called the MintCast. Now, there are some weeks where decades happen all at once. Syria has fallen and Assad has fled, and al-Nusra founder Abu Muhammad al-Julani has now taken power, much to the joy of his backers in Ankara, Tel Aviv, and Washington, D.C., who are working around the clock to remove him and his organizations from their terrorist lists. So how did this all happen, and how did Syria collapse so quickly? How will this affect the region, and what does this mean for the axis of resistance? To explore these questions, I am joined by Kevork Almassian. He's a Syrian journalist from Aleppo. Kevork hosts the YouTube channel Syriana Analysis, dedicated to all things Syria and West Asian politics. I'm also going to be joined later today by Syed Mohammed Marandi. He's a government advisor and professor of English literature and Orientalism at the University of Tehran. And thank you so much, Kevork, for joining us. We appreciate you making the time for us today.
With pleasure, especially with your amazing work about Palestine and your unique, let's say, skills in connecting the dots between Syria and Palestine and Lebanon, which is missing in the discourse of the ongoing discussion about what happened in Syria. Is it related to what happened in Gaza? Is it related to what happened in Lebanon? And unfortunately, connecting the dots has become really difficult for some people.
Absolutely. And I think that's why it's so important to support independent media, which is why I want to invite everybody who's watching and listening to us today to join our Patreon. As you know, there are very few of us left out there who are exposing the war machine and holding the US and Western military industrial complex accountable in connecting all of these dots and looking at the bigger geopolitical agenda. And so could I first get your reaction to the events that have taken place over the past 2 weeks in Syria, Kevork, as an indigenous Syrian from Aleppo? What have you made of these developments, and how did this happen?
Actually, I'm indigenous to Aleppo, but the HTS people who conquered Syria now, they don't consider me an indigenous because my grandparents survived the Armenian genocide 100 years ago and they found shelter in Aleppo. And for them, because they see things in a very, I would say, sectarian lens, so they don't even consider me a Syrian. So they're asking me to go back to Armenia. Let's see where this is going to end. But this is not a good start. If you want to have a mutual ground now with the people who conquered Syria, basically, the insurgency, let's say, which started in 2011, 2012, this was foreign funded. And this was the main reason and main factor why many people rejected what the press called a revolution, because the insurgency was supported by different regional and international powers, including countries which doesn't have or don't have the best interests of the people in heart, such as the US and Israel. And those were the same powers who destroyed Iraq. So people were asking, why would the United States support an insurgency in Syria? And does any good come from it? And this was a serious reason why many people supported Assad, because they found him a figure of unity and a person who fights against foreign interventions. I mean, the outcome of the conflict, now that I'm very critical of Bashar al-Assad, who fled the country and he left his people, basically, those who sacrificed for the country, for the sovereignty, for the territorial integrity, in the hands of HTS, and he fled to Moscow. And this is the worst thing that he could have done at the end of his tenure. If he wanted to leave, he could have talked to his people, be honest, thank them, and apologize for those who probably caused any harm, and tell the people that you're a divisive person now and there is a political settlement and you would like to leave in order to pave the way for country to recover, reconstruct, because the Americans aren't lifting the sanctions with my presence. So you had some arguments to sell to your people, but he didn't do any of it. Therefore, I consider this a cowardice and a treasonous act to leave this way to Moscow in any ways. Now, HTS is mainly supported by Turkey, which is a NATO country, and the funding is from Qatar. Turkey supplies the gear, the equipment, the training, which is all NATO gear, and Qatar supplies them with the money. And those are like contract army. it's their job. They wake up, they train, they fight, and this is what they do in their lives. And there are also multinational takfiris from all around the world, especially from the Xinjiang province of China, the Uyghurs. We have from Central Asian countries, we have Saudis, etc. And now the press is celebrating it as a liberation from the Assad dictatorship, but the replacement is going to be if it's going to be Jolani's people, then we have to expect for Syria, for the old Syria that we remembered, is gone forever. Because Syria was a multicultural and multi-ethnic, multi-religious country, and it had the state, what they called the regime, had a Jacobean force to enforce certain lifestyle. And if any particular group, for example, caused any instability in the country, social instability, trying to, for example, discriminate against other religions or sects, the state had enough power to suppress such, let's say, discriminative movements. But now the movement which is discriminative, and I would also call them racist and terroristic, the HDS, they have conquered Damascus. They have raised the black flags, and the fighters say that they want to establish an Islamic state. And for the people not to confuse with the Islamic Caliphate 1400 years ago, the type of the Islamic Caliphate that they're calling for, or Islamic State, is similar to what ISIS basically created. And it's going to be one-colored, and it's going to be very, I would say, radically to the opposite side of what Syria used to be in the past. And this is very concerning because this is what urged many people to support Assad to begin with. But all these people are now living in fear because there are summary executions. There are many people being executed today and yesterday in different cities like Latakia, Homs, Hama, and Damascus because they were accused of being Assad regime collaborators or belonging to the Alawite sect. So there are many revengeful acts because these people, HDS, they believe that the Alawites are infidels, and this was the main motivation behind why they continued this armed insurgency against Assad, because he was also from the Alawite sect.
And I think it's really important to understand what you're saying in terms of the black flags have been risen above these cities, because a lot of people now are celebrating, and the media right now, pretty much across the board, all corporate media, and we know why, are presenting one narrative, which is that Syrians are celebrating. And I believe that there are so many Syrians that are celebrating that were not supportive of the Assad government, and they're looking at this as liberation. But they're kind of forgetting that now Syria has been basically sold to the biggest bidder, which is al-Qaeda. And is this really a win for liberation and the anti-war movement, the anti-imperialist movement, and the pro-Palestine movement? Of course, I would argue that it's not. Of course, no country is a monolith. And we are seeing the Syrians that you're mentioning, they're being completely ignored and sidetracked within the corporate media coverage. And they're being taken out of the narrative of what's happening in Syria. How can we really celebrate this moment when the rebel advance to overthrow Assad has been led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, like you said? And this is a former deputy to ISIS leader Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in Iraq. He and his militants have committed grave war crimes against humanity, including public beheadings, destruction of religious sites, and attacks against Christians, minorities, and of course, even Muslim Sunnis. And so we have to remember that this sort of caliphate, or this Islamic state that al-Qaeda is establishing, isn't even Islamic. This is all, a political ideology that is backed by the West.
Yes.
And so could you talk a little bit more about that?
I think if there is any conspiracy against the Muslim people, is this type of groups. And it was impossible for these groups to see light were it not for the CIA support, the Mossad support, Saudi intelligence, Qatari intelligence, and Turkish intelligence. When after 9/11, when the anti-Islamic voices were very popular and normalized, the reason for it was the al-Qaeda. And when again the people were scared from Islam, it was during the era of ISIS Caliphate. So all these groups, we know concretely that first they were supported by the US in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union in order to fight against a mutual enemy. We know that these groups were also supporting Libya, in Syria, in Chechnya, in Yugoslavia, in different places. So I would argue that they are the geopolitical idiots of the empire, thinking that they are doing something good for their religion. But what they're basically doing, they are destroying their religion and their reputation and giving an impression to the rest of the world that the Muslims are terrorists. And this here is a big win for Israel. And all the crimes that Israel has committed in the past year in Palestine could go in vain, because now they can mask it and say, look at Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, what are they doing? Now we have to protect ourselves from the same terrorists that we were funding in the past and taking them in our hospitals and giving them medical treatment, cash, and even weapons. And these are all documentable and approved and agreed by the Israeli officials, Israeli former head of Mossad, Israeli press, etc. I think Syrians were very divided on Bashar al-Assad. Some hated him with their full guts, and some liked him and loved him. However, because between 2011 and 2017, the regime change war was mostly militarily, and people saw a concrete, let's say, enemy, and those were this Nusra, ISIS, and the rest. Therefore, they were motivated to fight them and join the army. And they were, let's say, the motivation factor were there. But when Trump ended the regime change war and he canceled this funding for these jihadists under the CIA program Timber Sycamore, then he imposed draconian sanctions on the Syrian people in order to suffocate and impoverish the Syrian people. And eventually 90% of the Syrians were pushed under the poverty line. And this was not the case till 2017, right? At the peak of the conflict and the war, the people were not as poor as they are today, but they have impoverished them. They have looted their oil and wheat and also imposed draconian sanctions in order to demoralize the people. And this is what they have achieved, basically. Now, in 2024, the people are devastated. The people can't find bread. The people can't afford meat or vegetables, basically. Their salaries are very, very, very low. And the government can only print Syrian money, and this only creates inflation because you can't sell anything outside. You can't import, you can't export. So you don't have dollar in your central bank or any other gold or, let's say, euros in order to back up your Syrian lira, and it drops. So this is what happened in 2024. When the attack happened, the people were not in the mood to fight. They were demoralized, they were impoverished, they were very in a bad mental position. So this led into fast expansion of HTS to Aleppo, or faster expansion of HTS to Aleppo. And this was all calculated because HTS, on the other hand, they enjoyed the Syrian lira, the Turkish lira. They had flow of cash from Qatar all the time. And they were they were equipped with NATO arms and equipment. And this was like a contract army. It's their job to fight. You receive monthly salary and you live a lavish life. Unlike the Syrian army, which was a military service, you go and serve your country and you don't get paid very little, let's say, per month compared with what HTS is. So now that Damascus is occupied by HTS, if you put the lens of this, the liberal democratic lens that Washington wants us to wear and look into the geopolitical conflicts, then it looks like it's liberation because Syrians liberated themselves from a dictator, right? But if you put a geopolitical lens and you see, like, zoom out a little bit and see the bigger picture and the geopolitical conflict in the region, you realize that Assad was not fought against by the US funded jihadists in Syria or Takfiris because he was a dictator. Because if that was the case, almost everyone in the region is a dictator. But why only Assad? Because Syria was part of the axis of resistance. It was the strategic depth of the axis of resistance. It had offices for the Palestinian factions, Hezbollah, and also used to be a territory for supply chains for Hezbollah. So this was the main reason why they wanted to overthrow Assad, basically. And this was the last offer that Assad received a few weeks ago from Jordan, that if you participate in the ceasefire agreement in Lebanon and siege Hezbollah, meaning cut the supply chains, then the upcoming administration Trump, he will try to open up with you and also lift some of the sanctions. And when he rejected, this HTS attack happened. So if you put the geopolitical lens, this basically means the end of the axis of resistance, because without supply chains to Hezbollah and without the access of Hezbollah to Syria and eventually to Iraq and Iran, Hezbollah is now a localized party. It's no longer a party which can go and fight in Syria or support the Yemenis or go and support the Iraqis. It becomes only a local player in Lebanon. Gaza is destroyed. Iran has pulled from Syria completely now because the upper hand is for Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, and USA. And the Iranians withdrew. So entire project that Iran tried to establish in the past 2-3 decades, the axis of resistance that Iran is leading, is going to disintegrate, and it's a matter of time. So I don't want to really sell illusions to the people. This is a big blow for anyone who thinks or who supports Palestine in this case and wanted for the struggle to continue against the occupation. Now Israel has the upper hand. And that's why Israel, once Assad was overthrown, destroyed entire Syrian army strategic stockpile, air defenses, navy, and anything and everything that could pose any danger against Israel. And now it occupies the higher hills in the Quneitira. So Israel has complete military superiority now over Syria, something that they wanted also to achieve in Iraq, and they did. So if you read the Union plan, you will know that there was an obsession for Israel to hit these Arabic armies and destroy them, Iraq and Syria. They wanted to do similar thing to Iran, but because the balance of power is not really big time in favor of Israel, so they had to try to cut what they called the arms of the octopus. And in this case is Hamas, Hezbollah, and now Assad gone. I think Iran will not have big access or any access to pose any threat, let's say, against the national security of Israel.
This is a huge blow for the resistance. And, I don't personally want to just think everything is all loom and doom and gloom, because the resistance still exists. But like you said, it's more going to be in individual, separate factions working on an individual basis. But this is a big checkmate for US empire and its allies in the region. And it's a huge blow for the liberation of Palestine. And I think that's really the missing piece of this conversation when it comes to all of these celebrations that are taking place, that the media is showing. And I'm finding that even within the pro-Palestine movement, not everybody, but a lot of people are getting upset. They're getting upset when we talk about the geopolitical aspect. They're like, just let Syrians celebrate for a moment, But it's like, what exactly are we celebrating? That Syria now has been taken over by al-Qaeda. And that is not good. And this is only going to work in the interest of Israel. I mean, look at Netanyahu in the Golan Heights, literally taking credit for what has happened in Syria. And so we are now looking at these celebrations in alignment with what Israel wants. I don't know where you have gone, Kevork. There you go.
I'm back.
Sorry about that. I just heard from Dr. Marandi, and this recording software does not work with in Iran. So when we end with you, I'll have to actually go on a different area or different links, different software to bring him on. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of what has happened in the last couple of years specifically that kind of led us to this moment. Things that have been happening behind the scenes that most people aren't really aware of. You mentioned a lot about the sanctions, the Caesar Act. Syria has been really pushed into a corner where Syria has been unable to rebuild after the United States occupying a third of its land, and after the Western-backed insurgency. So it seemed that, though, at the same time, that the Assad government was relatively stable and that its neighbors had largely given up almost on destabilizing it. But Syria was recently re-invited back into the Arab League. The Assad government was leaning a little bit more onto the Saudis in terms of, needing funds and support. It seemed like Saudi Arabia and other Arab states were courting him. And he was responding, for example, closing the Ansar Allah aligned embassy of Yemen, refusing to work with Ansar Allah Yemen's resistance and Iran's Al-Quds Brigade to put forces in Syria on the border of the Golan Heights to protect Syria from Israel. What was going on there behind the scenes, and why was Assad, slowly moving in that direction?
So in 2018, 2017, 2018, when Trump ended the regime change war, Saudis and the Emiratis started to open ties with Assad again. And the strategy is same. And they tried to, decouple Syria from Iran through force, the insurgency. They couldn't. So when they come back, they try to do it through persuasion. And because Syria was destroyed and the economy was in tatters, Syria needed financial support from the Arabic countries. And Syria found that a window of opportunity to recover some of its vital infrastructure, which the Emiratis and the Saudis funded, especially in Damascus. So this was important for Syria to pursue its national interests. However, Syria didn't give them much. Syria, there is this, maybe some of your audience may laugh, but there is the hamburger strategy, they say, that the Syrian regime follows. And it gives you the hamburger, and then it has it holds the meat. And once you take the hamburger, it takes the meat from it. So it eats the meat and gives you just bread. So this is what the Syrian regime was doing, basically, with the Arabic countries. It's cosmetic things, like closing the Ansarullah embassy, but at the same time, the security channels are open with Ansarullah through Iran. So you don't need an embassy to communicate with Ansarullah, but rather you can do it through your Iranian partners. And the Saudis were expecting from Syria to take concrete actions to decouple itself from Iran even further, and Syria rejected that. Because Syria knows that when the existential threat was looming and it was trying to, overcome the country, nobody came to defend Syria than Iran, Hezbollah, Russia, and the rest were sending weapons and ammunition to the opposite side, right? Therefore, Syria cannot and couldn't decouple from the Iranian axis. But the demand to send Ansarullah fighters to the Golan, it's very dangerous. We have to be careful, like Syria shouldn't be a territory for proxy war against Israel. If Syria wants to participate in the war, it has an army, or it had an army, and it had strategic weaponry, and it had defensive capabilities to do that. But bringing other fighters from other countries into Syria, this is going to be a proxy, and will definitely lead to Israel escalating directly on Damascus and Damascus neighborhoods and Damascus civilian infrastructure, something that Assad doesn't want to see. Syria already lived a devastating war. And watching the result of Gaza and southern Lebanon, you don't want to copy that once again on your people. But in any ways, those were the reasons why people supported him, as I mentioned. But after everything that he did, he again gave up on power to the same powers that we didn't want for them to occupy Syria. And those are the proxies of the US, of Israel, and the rest of the regional countries. And Syria is going to be divided into different spheres of influence. This is how the Americans start pushing their agenda. They don't come and divide the country or balkanize it right away. First, it's a sphere of influence, and then there are internal fights between these spheres of influence. And because there are probably 1 million different militias now in the country, so everybody says, we cannot really live together. Everybody is fighting everyone. You, this religion, you, this sect, have this militia, you, that have militia. Everybody just gets its own enclave, and we don't interact. This is what they're aiming at doing. They want to divide Syria, but this is going to take time. And first, they will create a sphere of zone for Turkey in Aleppo, Idlib, and Homs. And then Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Jordan, Damascus, and Daraa, Israel, Sueda, and in the east, the Kurds are going to be under American supervision. So in the future, I think if these different regional powers do not come into consensus in Syria, you're going to see conflict between these militias supported by different powers, because the experience of the past years shown to us that, for example, in suburbs of Damascus, militias funded by Qatar fighting militias funded by Saudi Arabia, and those are both anti-Assad. So expecting them now all of a sudden unite and lay down their arms and be civilized and participate in a political process is a very naive thing to expect. And now that we see the footage, the gruesome footage coming from Syria, executions, summary executions, hanging people in the streets, this is not a democratic revolution which believes in a rule of law. This is the indication. If that is the case, if there was anyone who committed a crime, put him in trial and send him to jail, or in Syria, execution legally is permissible. But executing people in the streets because previously they were with the Assad government or benefited from the Assad government, that's not how, in my opinion, someone can build a rule of law. And this is the mentality of HDS, the other Islamist groups. I'm not against a democratic state. I think I'm more democratic than the people think. They oppose Assad because they want democracy for Syria. But I'm a realist. And when I see a group says, we don't believe in democracy and we want to exterminate this group and that group, and telling me this group will establish a democratic state, then you are fooling me. Excuse me, but I'm a Syrian, and these people are pundits sitting thousands of kilometers away, and they don't dare to come and move to Syria and live now under the Jolani's rule, but they want to export this type of system to Syria and establish this type of system in Syria, something that is very criminal, for the Syrian people.
I mean, this is exactly what we saw in Libya when Muammar Gaddafi was taken out. I mean, he was dragged through the street and slaughtered with a bayonet. And he was sodomized and dragged through the street. Of course, that didn't happen to Assad, but I think if he would have stayed, that might have been his ending too. Because the people that are ruling over Syria now are almost the same people and kinds of people with the same intentions that are ruled over Libya, taken over Libya post the US-backed NATO so-called humanitarian intervention that Samantha Powers and Barack Obama supported in spreading democracy and human rights there. And look at Libya now. It's a completely failed state. They've executed people on the streets. They're selling slaves on the streets openly. It's disgusting. It's disturbing. So this is not a win for democracy. And I know that you have to go, Kevork, very soon. So
I would just mention one thing, Manav, because your audience are mostly also pro-Palestine, right?
I think so.
Unfortunately speaking, I'm saying, our region in West Asia, Middle East, has witnessed many, many wars. And these wars should have served the people as an open book to learn from the close history. But if I'm giving you an open book and I'm reading you the pages and you can understand the language and you can read and you see what has happened and what were the consequences, and you still want to repeat it, this means that history doesn't repeat itself, but rather the people do not learn. And I don't blame always the ordinary people because the propaganda is too big, but the propagandists and the people who claim to be pro-Palestine and they are pushing for this narrative, I would be very happy if Assad is gone and a democratic government is installed in Damascus, also keeping its position and sovereignty and also support for their brothers and sisters in Lebanon and Palestine. But if all these things aren't going to happen, it's not going to be democratic, and it's not going to be supportive for their brothers and sisters in Palestine and in Lebanon, then I don't think this is an upgrade, it's a downgrade. And this is something I try to explain, but people are too either sectarian or they have been, I call them Jazeeratized, which Jazeera is the biggest psyop, in my opinion, in the region, psyoping people into becoming hostile to the allies of the Palestinian people, basically, right?
Absolutely. And it's unfortunate that people have, come to be, propagandized at such a high rate.
Yes, massive scale.
On a massive scale, exactly. And, just before you go, Kevork, if you can just answer one question for me, because, one aspect of this we should touch on is the Israeli one. I mean, it's no secret that al-Jilani and his forces, whatever name they want to go by, have been trained, armed, and supported by the Israeli government directly, not just Turkey and Qatar. So HTS al-Nusra commanders have taken time out of their busy schedules to conduct interviews with Israeli media to talk about how they want to normalize relations with Israel and thanking them for their crucial help and their support, and declaring that it's Hezbollah and Iran that are the real enemies, right, of Syria, not Israel.
Why
And
is the surprise? Where is the surprise? This is the case. Exactly, this is the case.
yeah, so I mean, they're openly HTS saying that they are talking about a new era of friendship with Israel, and even asking for Israeli aid in constructing a new Syrian society. So Israel will plant a rose in the Syrian garden, said somebody in the Israeli government. Now Israeli tanks are in Damascus suburbs. As we speak, in the IDF has annexed huge parts of southern Syria already. To what extent has Israel been a factor in this military operation? And I'll leave it at that.
I think Israel always saw Syria as a threat, and this is mentioned by every Israeli official, and mostly because Syria, after Egypt withdrew from the Arab-Israeli conflict and signed the accords with Israel, Syria didn't have the opportunity and the chance to go to war against Israel, because Syria is a small country, small economy, and compared to the security and military aid that Israel receives, Syria cannot match the Israeli force. Therefore, there were an attempt to change the struggle against Israel through the allies, the non-state actors like Hezbollah and other factions in Palestine. So Israel saw this as a window of opportunity to destabilize Syria since 2011. That's why they supported HTS when they used to be called al-Nusra, and they gave them medical support, they say light weapons, and also cash money to the militants. Because Israel wanted to weaken Syria. First, they thought that it would be a great idea to weaken Syria to the extent that Syria is no longer a threat, but they couldn't destroy the strategic weaponry of Syria, something that they had the opportunity now to do once Assad was gone and the weapons were all evacuated. So Israel carried out around 300 airstrikes and destroyed the entire Syrian stockpile, air defenses, the navy, and almost everything that could present as Syria's defensive capabilities and also deterrence capabilities, which means that now Syria is without any military force. And even if the so-called HTS want to fight against the Israelis, they don't have a chance. But this is not going to happen at all, because first things first, HTS is under the control of the Turkish and American intelligence, and they're the ones guiding these groups where to go and what to do. And it would be very naive to expect for HTS to go to war. Maybe for cosmetic reasons, probably in the future they try to shoot some bullets, but they don't have any, let's say, tank division or any air force to fight against Israel. So Israel will see that even more opportunity to conquer more land inside Syria and establish itself as an occupation force in more larger swaths of territories, let's say, compared to what they have already occupied. Syria is without any military force now. What are they going to do with Israel? I think Israel established itself on the higher hills. It is sealing the borders with Lebanon, and it's 20 kilometers away from Damascus. Now Israel has this complete superiority. Turkey and Israel are the biggest winners of this regime change war in Syria. So I give this as a food for thought for the people to think about it.
Absolutely. And Kevork, I know you have to go, so we thank you very much for your time and your efforts, and for helping us understand what's happening on the ground in Syria from a larger geopolitical perspective. And please do follow Syriana Analysis with Kevork. Thank you so much, Kevork.
Thank you.
All right, so we just heard from Kevork Almassian from Syriana Analysis give us a perspective, an anti-imperialist perspective from a Syrian, a voice of many Syrians that have been left out from the corporate media coverage of what's happening inside of Syria with this al-Qaeda takeover of Damascus, with the fall of Assad. And now we are joined by Professor Dr. Mohammed Marandi. He is a professor an advisor to the government in Iran. He's based in Tehran, and it's a pleasure to be joined by you, Dr. Marandi. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for having me. Just one thing, I'm not an advisor. I was a media advisor to the nuclear negotiating team in 2015 and 3 years ago.
Oh, thank you for correcting me. I appreciate that. Sorry about that. And so we wanted to bring you on, Dr. Marandi, because we wanted to hear from a Syrian perspective what was happening on the ground, but it would be good to get your perspective about what this really means for the axis of resistance and Iran's role, and where Iran and the axis of resistance are going to be headed moving in the future, because what has taken place in Syria with the fall of Assad and the takeover by HTS, and with the government of Benjamin Netanyahu basically taking some credit for what has happened in Syria, this has been a major blow for the resistance in the region, and I'm sure for Iran and Russia as well. So first, let me just get your reaction to what has happened now with the fall of Assad and the rise of al-Qaeda inside Syria.
Well, if we go back to 2011, with the rise of al-Qaeda in Syria, the Iranians became deeply concerned. They didn't get involved until 2013, as did Hezbollah and others. And that was because by that time there were already tens of thousands of foreign fighters inside Syria, which had come mostly from Turkey. Turkish intelligence, along with other NATO countries and oil and gas-rich family dictatorships in the Persian Gulf, they all facilitated the movement of extremist terrorists to Syria. And so in 2013, when their numbers rose immensely and they were al-Qaeda and ISIS, the Iranians began to intervene. So back then, the issue was not a legitimate opposition. The issue was al-Qaeda. And we have to remember that Jake Sullivan on February the 12th, 2012 said to Hillary Clinton in an email that in Syria, al-Qaeda or al-Qaeda is on our side. And of course, we know from the 2012 Defense Intelligence Agency document that regional regimes, including Erdogan and others, were trying to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. That, of course, was ISIS. And General Michael Flynn, who had led that agency, he said that Obama supported this policy. In other words, supported empowering ISIS. And Kerry, too, in a leaked audio, said that the U.S. allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus. And there's a lot of other evidence. And of course, Iranian intelligence saw this from the very beginning. What we saw more recently was a repeat of the same problem. The Iranians, their concern was about the rise of al-Qaeda and ISIS, because both of them are heavily infiltrated by Western intelligence agencies, including Turkey and other regimes in the Persian Gulf. And they are extremist groups. Otherwise, the issue for Iran is not an opposition, or they have no obsession with preserving former President Assad. The issue was always al-Qaeda. And so right now, as we see Syria fall, the Iranians, I think, were expecting what we see today, that the Israelis would be gloating, that Netanyahu would be taking credit, that Biden would be taking credit, and that Erdogan, because of his own ego and his own selfish interests, has put the Israeli regime in a very strong position, to be very blunt. The Israeli regime had lost the war because they had to win. The very fact that they couldn't defeat Hezbollah meant that the Israeli regime lost. The fact that they couldn't exterminate the Palestinian population in Gaza meant that they had lost. The fact that they couldn't have the upper hand in the missile and exchanges and drone exchanges with Iran meant that they lost. But this was a major stab in the back to the axis of resistance, which needed Syrian territory to help the Palestinian people. And it's not just Lebanon, it's also the West Bank. It's over now, but the weapons that you see in the West Bank, the capabilities that you see in the West Bank, they all go through Syria. So that is going to be a major challenge in the future, especially since it is well known that al-Qaeda, the leaders of al-Qaeda in Syria have no intention whatsoever to confront the Israeli regime. And we do not see that as we speak. They've allowed the Israelis to destroy Syria's military infrastructure. They have not protested. They have not said anything. And we've seen them allow the Israeli regime to advance close to Damascus. And again, they have done nothing about it. And only today, apparently, as Erdogan said, made some verbal complaint. But this is the same Erdogan that's been selling or facilitating the sales of cheap oil from Baku to Netanyahu for the last 14 months. He's preserved ties. Senior intelligence officers go back and forth. So it is a difficult situation, without a doubt, for the resistance. It will be difficult for Hezbollah, although Hezbollah's military infrastructure, contrary to what the West says, is intact. Its underground tunnels across southern Lebanon and central Lebanon are very much intact. Its weapons, they have enough weapons to fight for a very, very long time. Also, Iran has been able to send in a lot of support to Gaza, even though Gaza was fully surrounded. Lebanon is not a fully surrounded country, and there are ways to do things for Lebanon that have already been done for the people of Gaza and for the people of Yemen during the Saudi war on Yemen, where the Americans were patrolling the Red Sea back then. But even then, Iranian support was getting to Yemen, it was getting to Gaza, and I don't think that Hezbollah is really that worried. Although it would be it would be a challenge, it would be difficult, but they'll manage.
Well, there's a lot of, doom and gloom talk out there right now that the axis of resistance is done. It's over. This is the end of the axis of resistance. Of course, I don't know if I agree with that perspective. Maybe one channel has been cut off, but that doesn't mean that the fight and access to and the unity among certain nations and groups to continue to resist Israeli occupation and expansionist interests has necessarily ended, because, like you said, there are other ways. I don't know what those other ways are, of course, because, I don't know. I'm not in those internal circles. But it seems like there's two debates going on, that the axis is over with, it's done. And then there's one that's like, wait a second, we don't know actually the full picture. So what is your perspective? I mean, how is the axis going to move forward? And do you think the axis of resistance is done and complete for? I just spoke with Kevork, who's a Syrian journalist, and his perspective was that the axis is now over. It's done. What do you think?
No, I don't believe that to be the case. I think that Hezbollah will emerge stronger. The war taught it a lot of lessons about the Israeli regime's capabilities and its vulnerabilities. They will rearm, they will reorganize, and they will be able to be an effective resistance force in future. I think that despite the fact that Netanyahu did achieve a big score or a big win in Syria for the short term, the delegitimization of Zionism in the eyes of the global public, the fact that the world has seen a Holocaust being carried out against Palestinians, that is not something that can be reversed. And that is probably the biggest win for the axis of resistance, the delegitimization of the Israeli regime in the eyes of so many people, even in the West. In addition to that, I think that the situation in Syria is not going to be so easily controlled by the Israelis or Mr. Erdogan or the Americans. Al-Qaeda is a group with a very extremist tendency, a very extremist ideology, and Jolani, who of course was a lieutenant, a deputy for Abu Bakr Baghdadi when he was the head of the Islamic State of Iraq. He was sent, so he was in ISIS, he was sent to set up a Nusra in Syria, so he commanded the al-Qaeda faction in Syria, because back then the Islamic State of Iraq was al-Qaeda. They later separated. So it's the same ideology, but Jolani and Abu Bakr Baghdadi had a fallout over power. It became the Islamic State of Iraq became the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham or Syria, and Jolani didn't accept that. And interestingly, Al-Qaeda Central, the Central Command, sided with Jolani, and that's why ISIS broke away from Al-Qaeda, because of their support for Jolani's position. But his supporters are extremists. Even if he wanted to become more moderate, and with the background of ISIS and Al-Qaeda that he has, that's not something that I can really imagine. But even if he wanted to move in a different direction, his supporters many of his supporters would not accept that. And more importantly, many of the other factions will not accept that. And we've already seen that in Idlib. During the past few years in Idlib, we've seen a lot of conflict. We've seen the different factions attack each other, kill each other, take over each other's military bases, and then the other side counter-striking. So in that small territory called Idlib, these groups couldn't tolerate each other. And now with this huge country being controlled by them, I do not see them as being able to preserve their unity. And also, the situation in Syria is getting worse. The Israeli regime has destroyed the military infrastructure. These groups that came into the cities, they themselves or other people, they've been looting the central bank, looting government buildings, destroying government buildings. This is only going to make the situation worse. And these people are not the sort of people who can run a country. So I think the situation in Syria is going to be complicated. They'll be fighting with Kurdish groups. And we already see the beginning of the slaughter of minorities, especially in Latakia. Today, a lot of footage is coming out of mass killings. So I don't believe they're going to be able to stabilize Syria. And I think actually in the long term, and this is, I'm sorry for this long response, but this is where I wanted to get to. The countries that have been supporting Al-Qaeda, I think in the long run, they are the ones who are going to suffer the most. Turkey is going to have a huge burden. It's going to be burdened by Syria, not just because of the extremism that's going to come out of Syria. And remember, there are many thousands of foreign fighters, and this is already causing anger in China. But Central Asia countries are going to have a problem with Turkey because it's taking their citizens and turning them into killers. But Turkey is also going to have economic problems because of the burden of Syria. They're going to have to fund, along with Qatar, they're going to have to fund Al-Qaeda in order, and that is it's going to cost a lot more than the funding that they've been providing for Idlib. But even beyond Turkey and Qatar, I think that the spread of extremism is a real possibility. Remember, just as an example, Jordan aside, Egypt aside, right now Mohammed bin Salman has pushed Saudi Arabia in a very different direction from the past. In the past, Malik Abdullah, he used to see himself or be presented as the let's say, the godfather of Wahhabism and Salafism. And Mohammed bin Salman is the exact opposite. He has moved Saudi Arabia towards secularism. He brings half-naked women singers and dancers to ceremonies and concerts, and that is not something that the Salafists or the Wahhabis would find acceptable. So not only did he and others do nothing for Gaza as the Holocaust was being carried out, and it still is being carried out as we speak, but now we have a successful al-Qaeda revolution, or al-Qaeda coup, or al-Qaeda takeover. And I think a lot of people in Saudi Arabia will be thinking about that. They'll say, well, our al-Qaeda brothers in Syria were able to achieve revolution. We should overthrow the regime here and bring our Islam, their Islam, to Saudi Arabia.
Gotta make that clear. Their Islam.
Right. Yes, it's not your Islam or my Islam, but their Islam. Yeah.
Right.
and you know, it's just like, it's the same. Al-Qaeda and ISIS have nothing to do with Sunni Islam. This is Wahhabism. Just as Zionism has nothing to do with Judaism, just as the Nazis have nothing to do with Christianity. So sadly, these groups have allowed the Orientalists and those who are Islamophobic and those who are antagonistic towards Muslims to show them as representatives of Muslims in Islam, but that's of course not the case. They are more linked to Western intelligence agencies than they are to the indigenous Muslim populations.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you mentioned that kind of bigger, longer perspective, because I think people are looking at what's happening now and thinking, oh my gosh, this is a huge blow for the axis of resistance, and they're not seeing the ramifications possibly of how encouraging and supporting these, black flag bearers and al-Qaeda groups is going to actually have a big blowback on the very countries that support them. And that's a very interesting perspective to share, because I don't think a lot of people have said that. So it's definitely food for thought and something for a lot of people to think about. Now, I think a lot of people are also wondering, where was Iran when this HTS takeover took place? Where was Iran and Russia and China? Where were they when this happened? People have asked, how could they have allowed this to happen? But I think that people have to remember that Syria is a sovereign nation, and Assad and his government have their own military and their own army. And actually, Iran and Russia were not really involved that much inside Syria at that time when all of this happened. Maybe on an outsider advisor perspective, but not really on the ground. And so could you tell us, where was Iran and what was Iran saying to Assad? Were they trying to preserve his presidency or not? What happened with the Assad-Iran relationship that led up to this point?
Well, in 2012, 13, 14, I used to say this on international media. When I was invited, I would say it on Al Jazeera as well. And then I was banned from Al Jazeera for quite a while. But Iran, from the very beginning, was calling on the government in Syria to change its policies, to take into consideration, more consideration, the needs of civil society, and to treat people who may be protesting or people who they arrest in a better way. And that did cause friction between Iran and the Syrian government. And as I said, the Iranians did not get involved in Syria, or nor did Hezbollah, until 2013. And by that time, there were massive numbers of foreign fighters in the country. And the foreign fighters, as well as the Syrian extremists who were members of ISIS and al-Qaeda or their affiliates, Jaish al-Islam, and other such groups, both the foreigners and the Syrians who were members, they were very dangerous. They were dangerous for the region. They were dangerous for Iran. They were dangerous for Iraq. They were dangerous for Lebanon. So Iran felt it had to get involved. In this case, it was very different. Although Iran had warned President Assad of the situation in Idlib, not much was done. And Iran's warnings came, they were different types of warnings, but from 6 months ago till a couple of months ago, Iran had told them this. And I think that the Syrians probably knew as well. They had their own sources. And so did the Russians, from my understanding. But and also the Iranians knew that the defense positions of the army were not good at all. There was only one line of defense around Idlib, and if one line of defense falls, then there's nothing to fall back on. And so when they attacked and they took the first line of defense, there was nothing to hold them back, and they swiftly went to Aleppo. But in addition to that, Syria, the sanctions have emptied Syria. They've destroyed Syria. The misery in Syria is because of the sanctions. And the country's been emptied out. On the one hand, the Americans, they imposed the Caesar sanctions on ordinary Syrians. And on the other hand, they steal the oil and the grain from northeastern Syria and export it or use it for their allies. And to the southeast, the Americans are working with tribes that were part of ISIS before. And in the north, the Turkish government, or Erdogan, I like to say Erdogan because I don't want to attribute it to Turkey. I have many Turkish friends, even in his party, and many of them have said to me they completely disagree with these policies. In fact, almost everyone I know, even in his party. So I attribute it to Erdogan. Erdogan's his support for these terrorists in the north continued to impose over these last few years have continued to impose a heavy burden on the Syrians, and then the Israelis in the south they constantly bomb targets inside Syria. Of course, unlike now, the Syrians would defend themselves, but still the Israelis would cause damage. So over the years, this became worse, and it's sort of like what we have in Cuba now. I was in Cuba a while back, a very beautiful country, of very friendly people, but they were really in bad shape. And most young people that I met just wanted to have a better life. They had given up on politics, and I think that that's exactly what the Americans want. The Americans want people to be so desperate that whatever they impose, people will embrace out of desperation. And I'm fearful for Cuba right now. I'm fearful to a lesser degree for Nicaragua, and Venezuela, because that's exactly the policy that the Americans are pursuing in Latin America. And I think countries like China should think about this, or Russia or Iran and others, that the financial system is a weapon, and it is a deadly weapon, and the Americans are using it effectively. So we often hear that sanctions they don't bring down, they don't lead to so-called regime change. But I think in the case of Syria, sanctions played a key role. Yeah. So, a general in the Syrian army earned $40 a month. And some of these al-Qaeda terrorists earn $2,000 a month. So that leads to corruption. And if you do find someone who's not corrupt, that leads to very miserable state of affairs. The soldiers don't have food to eat, and that's the general. I mean, if the soldiers are paid much less, so I don't even think, and this is my personal analysis, and there's reason to believe that this is correct. I think I've heard from others who should know about what's going on inside Turkey. I have reason to believe that Turkey did not expect this sort of success. They were not planning to go all the way to Damascus. They wanted to take Aleppo because that's what Turkey likes to see as its sphere of influence. They consider it to be Erdogan. I don't mean Turks, but Erdogan considers it to be a part of Turkey or Turkey's sphere of influence. But also they wanted to take that city to put pressure on President Assad to legitimize the Turkish occupation of the north. But then the defenses collapse and these terrorists move south. And I think that is something, and I think Turkey right now is worried. Turkey is worried about what I was discussing earlier, about the burden, both with regards to the economy, but also with regards to extremism that it's going to impose on the country. So they quickly went to the south. The Iranians, during these days, they told the government of Syria that we are willing to help, but the Syrians didn't give a clear response. And as things got worse, the Iranians told President Assad, and he changed his position a couple of times. And finally, when he said, okay, it was too late. Damascus was on the verge of collapse. So, but if Iran were to enter, it would be because of al-Qaeda, not because of anything else. In other words, for Iran, this was between a government that was deeply flawed, even back then, but more so now, because sanctions corrupt. Sanctions bring about greater misery. But a government that they saw it as deeply flawed, but at the same time, they always saw ISIS and al-Qaeda and Jaish al-Islam and the others as much more deadly and dangerous.
And we know that, U.S. politicians have openly stated that the purpose of sanctions is to turn the people against the government. That's how they worked in Venezuela. That's how they work in Iran, in Syria. That is the purpose of U.S. sanctions, is to cripple the economy and have the people get so desperate, so angry, not even be able to afford a loaf of bread. It hasn't gotten to that point in Iran, of course, because Iran has always been a powerhouse in, turning these events, to build and manufacture things on their own. But in countries like Venezuela or Syria, things have gotten pretty desperate. And they were very desperate inside Syria, to the point where people could literally not afford a loaf of bread. And so the Caesars Act, which targeted the Syrian people, really pushed people, over the brink to want their government overthrown, to want the regime change. And that's why we're seeing so many Syrians celebrating the fall of Assad. They blamed Assad on the economic, the lack of economic reforms and so forth. And of course, Assad himself, no country is a monolith, right? Of course, there was corruption, and of course, there were so many things that could have been reformed. And I think it's really important to talk about, of course, we should support the Syrian people's want and need for freedom and liberation and, human rights and, reform and all of those things. But Syria was never given that opportunity because it was flooded with Western-backed insurgents. And so for people to say, we have to celebrate this moment because Syrians are now liberated, they're not liberated. They have now, the country has now been sold to al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda that is backed by Israel, backed by Mossad, by the United States, by the CIA, by Turkey, and by these Gulf states. And so I think something that we should talk about is from an Iranian perspective, and you kind of hinted at it, in a few places. What mistakes do you think Assad made that led to this place?
Well, first, I just want to stress on 2 points that you made for your audience. We should all really think about this carefully. I mean, the Holocaust in Gaza, the fact that we've had this for 14 months and the West fully supports it, the Western media fully supports it, I think discredits it completely. And I think it shows that we shouldn't trust anything in the Western media when it comes to Syria or anything else. Gaza has proven them to be completely morally bankrupt.
Absolutely.
But the sanctions used by the West, they are tools that target ordinary people. They are targeting women and children. They're targeting infants. They want to create as much misery as possible. They want people to die because of a lack of medication, and that happens a lot. So this is war against women and children, the sanctions regime, but it's a quiet war.
Yeah.
But it's no less inhumane than when they bomb buildings with bunker busters, when they bomb residential towers, as they did in Lebanon or in Gaza. The second point that I think is key, and that is that the invasion of Syria by a foreign power or a collection of foreign powers through their proxies should be seen as identical to a potential invasion of Cuba or Venezuela or Nicaragua by a foreign power. It is unacceptable, morally unacceptable. I'm not a communist, so I would probably not be a member of the Communist Party in Cuba, but I would always be supportive of the Cuban state, despite whatever flaws it has, in the face of imperialism, in the face of aggression, in the face of US domination, in the face of sanctions. So our view on Syria is the same as our view on Nicaragua, Venezuela, or any other country. We oppose what they did to Libya. Gaddafi was not, in my house, there was no poster of Gaddafi. But Libya was the most wealthy country in Africa. And even if it wasn't, that's still not, if it was the poorest country in Africa, it still did not give the US the right to impose sanctions or to use a terrorist organization to undermine the country. So, I think these are things that we should be, your viewers and ourselves, we should be thinking about, because it says a lot. I think it explains a lot about what the United States and the Europeans, the nature of these regimes, what the nature of these regimes are. And it says, and I think it helps explain why it is that we're so opposed to these intervention. It's not just because it's al-Qaeda and they are horrible, but also the very notion of Western intervention is illegitimate. Just like in Iraq, I fought against Saddam Hussein. I was a volunteer in the war. I was gassed twice thanks to German chemical weapons.
Wow.
But when the United States wanted to invade Afghanistan and Iraq, I was probably, maybe I'm wrong, but I think I was in the very first anti-war demonstration in the UK in Birmingham when Blair came to inaugurate a European Studies Center or Institute at the University of Birmingham. It was when they wanted to invade Afghanistan, and there were only 50, 60, 70 of us there. And we were protesting against the war, not because I was a fan of the Taliban, but because I opposed Western intervention in the country. And of course, I participated in the anti-war protests with regards to Saddam Hussein. I fought against Saddam Hussein, but I was opposed to Western intervention against the country, just as I was opposed to sanctions against the country, because they have no moral right to undermine Iraq. So, but with regards to Assad, I think it's difficult to say how much control he had and how much was beyond his control, because the Ba'athist Party in Syria, I've been to Syria many times, both before the Dirty War in 2011 and after it. During the Dirty War, I'd go there 3-4 times a year. I'd go to universities. And I should say that I would often, for example, lecture classes in English for students that were interested and spoke English. And students would come up to me after class, and some of them loved Assad. Some of them liked him. Some of them, it was clear, didn't like him. And some of them, it was obvious that they didn't like him at all. But it was almost universal. During those years that I would go to the University of Damascus, that no one liked what the Turks were trying to impose on them. No one wanted ISIS or al-Qaeda. That it was clear, even those who did not like former President Assad. But I think, so I'm not sure how much control, if President Assad wanted to do certain things, how much the party would cooperate with him. Because from the Ba'athist Party there had a lot of control. There were different intelligence agencies. They were in power far before he was. He was not the person who was planned to be the leader of the country. But I think the biggest mistake that he had was that let me say 2 or 3 things. One is that I think that many of the elites, they were doing much better than ordinary people. Their homes, for example, the restaurants in the wealthy parts of Damascus, even as things were very bad, were full of wealthy people. And the people were having, the restaurants were serving very good food. The last time I went to Syria was just a few months ago, when I was invited by the foreign ministry for a panel discussion. And one of the restaurants that I went to was fantastic. And there were lots of young people there, and they were with their cell phones. And obviously they had a very different lifestyle than the overwhelming majority. And that's, of course, something that I think in Venezuela and Iran and Cuba and everywhere where you have sanctions and you're being targeted by the United States, the government has to be very careful about, because when people are under pressure, you need them more than under normal circumstances. So I think the gap between the elites in Syria and ordinary people was very wide. Another is, I think that it's very clear that the Syrian government should have been much more they should have been much more tolerant to opposition. Of course, I know when you have ISIS and al-Qaeda, it's going to get brutal. War is brutal. But in any case, there are certain things that you just have to do. When we were fighting against Saddam Hussein, we were trained to take as many prisoners as possible. That was our ideology. And that's how we were taught. And for example, I remember during probably the most difficult battle of the war, called the Karbala 5 operation, and I was a military diver. When we attacked Iraqi positions, we surrounded a small group of Iraqis, and they were shooting at us. And one of my comrades, he knew some Arabic, so he said, let me go and try to convince them to surrender. And when he went and spoke with them, they killed him. And then the shooting began, and then the Iraqis who were, trapped, there were 14 of them, they surrendered. We didn't do anything even though this was a person who lived with us. He was a military diver, and military divers are very close because we're a small group of people. We didn't, not only that, it was very hot. We were wearing our, the clothes that we wore made it very warm. It was a war. It was a battle. We gave them our canteens. I gave them my canteen. because I wanted them to see, look, you're our brothers. We're not your enemies.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how we were taught to deal with these people. And Syrians would tell me that the behavior I don't mean to say everyone in the Syrian army, but the behavior of Hezbollah or troops affiliated to Iran was considerably better than the behavior of many of the soldiers of the Syrian army in dealing with people in areas that were occupied by the terror organizations. So I would say these are the two major things. But at the same time, when the Americans speak about the Syrian dictatorship, all of their allies in our region are dictatorships. But the difference is that all those dictatorships are pro-American, and they have very good ties with the Europeans and the Americans. They have no problems with any of them at all. And also, the Americans have still not closed Guantanamo Bay. The Americans had Abu Ghraib. Abu Ghraib. Well, I'm sure you know this. You're much more familiar with these things than I. But you know that the pictures that we see of Abu Ghraib, the famous pictures, actually 2 or 3 of those pictures is a young Iranian. No one knows this, but he went to Iraq and he was there for pilgrimage, and they just took him, and the guy who's naked and the dog is attacking him, that's a young Iranian. He was on Iranian TV 3-4 years ago explaining his ordeal. But that's not really relevant. Sorry. It was just an interesting footnote.
Well,
the
a man
real
who was
pictures,
on pilgrimage, who was not even,
Yeah, but so were a lot of the other Iraqis.
Of course, yeah.
And there were women there who were raped, and it was. But the pictures that we see, those were the pictures that the U.S. government allowed to be released to the public. The really bad pictures are hidden from the public. They're. That's what we don't see them. So imagine what those really look like.
Yeah, I mean, it's hypocrisy when the United States and Israel and all these Gulf states, especially the United States, which is the largest exporter of terrorism in the world, cries about human rights and democracy, right? We have our problems here in this country, and we have a foreign policy that is fueled by the blood, by the occupation, by the exploitation of other countries. It is disgusting, and it's completely hypocritical.
And we have an ongoing Holocaust in Gaza.
Yeah. And
an ongoing, nothing that Syria has done, nothing that Egypt has done, nothing that Saudi Arabia has done. Of course, Yemen was horrific, but I mean inside Saudi Arabia, compares to what the Israelis have done in Gaza in front of the eyes of the world. Yeah. So, for the West to be talking about human rights or for countries in the region, which have powerful media because of oil and gas, for them to be talking about freedom when they are the ones who've been funding ISIS and al-Qaeda, that's really that's quite outrageous.
Yeah, I mean, we have to consider that Israel wants all eyes off of Gaza. They want all eyes off of Palestine. They don't want people to talk about a Palestinian state. Israel wants. I remember talking to people who are pro-Israel, and I would bring up what's happening in Gaza, and they say, you Arabs, you Arabs, always talking about what Israel's doing. Go look at what Assad is doing in Syria. They love to put it back on Assad and what's happening in Syria, without the context, of course, of this Western-backed insurgency. So it's really
whatever Assad's flaws, whatever evil exists in his personality, he was fighting the ISIS and al-Qaeda and their affiliates that Israel and the West and their regional clients had imposed on his country. So when they say he killed hundreds of thousands of his own people, they're trying to distract attention away from the fact that they are the ones who killed hundreds of thousands of Syrians. Mm-hmm. They want to blame him, whereas in reality, there is definitely blood on the hands of the Syrian government, but there's much more blood on the hands of those who carried out this dirty war. And there's even more blood on the hands of the Israeli regime than on the hands of the Americans and the Europeans. Well, Gaza's a joint operation.
Yeah.
But the blood that's on their hands in Gaza is beyond anything else that we've seen, especially because it was carried out in front of cameras and they had no
That was
shame.
live stream. The first live stream genocide in history. Here
Absolutely.
it is. It's what's happening in Gaza. And of course, I talked about this with Kevork before you came on. The people that are celebrating in Syria for the fall of Assad are just one fraction and one piece of the story. There are so many Syrians who are terrified of what's going to come next. And those people and other minorities in Syria are not even mentioned within corporate media circles about, their fears of what this HTS or al-Qaeda takeover means for those groups. But anyways, I know we both have to wrap up very soon, but I just want to kind of end with the future of, U.S. imperialism when it comes to Iran, because now we have a new Trump presidency that's coming up. And, Trump is just another war hawk who is surrounded by the very swamp that he claims to have cleansed Washington of. He's got the neoconservatives and all of these people that are very, very hawkish towards Iran. And of course, these are the same kind of ideologies that dominate, the Biden administration. So we're not really going to get anything different when it comes to Trump in terms of foreign policy. It seems as though now the mask is going to come off a little bit more again, and we're going to get more people like Marco Rubio, who is really determined to overthrow the government of Nicolas Maduro and do regime change in Iran. So now we have this chaos that has unfolded inside of Syria. Do you think, I guess I have two questions for you that are left. One of them is, will these groups, yes, they're going to create this instability within Syria, but will this group try to attack Iran? Because they've already said our enemy, Jelani himself said, our enemy is not Israel or the West, it's Iran, it's Hezbollah. So what are they going to be attacking Iran? Is Iran, under the impression that they're going to be next in terms of like another proxy war? Or is it going to be more of a direct confrontation from the United States with the Trump presidency coming up? I guess those are two kind of separate questions, but related.
Well, al-Qaeda is definitely a Western tool, and there's no doubt about that. And the very fact that in his first speech, he said nothing about Israel, which was bombing Damascus and bombing the country as he was making that speech. As they were advancing on Damascus as he was making that speech, he said nothing about animosity towards the Israeli regime. And I find that quite extraordinary. And I think that really it says it all. And that explains why Iran, from the very beginning, was very much against ISIS and al-Qaeda entering Syria. And I think, to be very blunt, it says everything about Erdogan and his relations with Israel and all that. And he is probably the greatest disappointment for our region, because Turkey, if it had been working with the resistance, I think that the Israelis would be on their knees. And if they had joined, they would have tipped the balance. But they did the exact opposite. But in any case, it was a historic moment where if the Turks went in the other direction, Israel would have been devastated. If it had remained neutral, at least, and it never was neutral because it was doing trade, but if it had cut off ties, just cut off ties and cut off the oil, it would have hurt the Israeli regime badly. But what they did is the exact opposite. They went and saved the day for Netanyahu. But I'm sure that these terror organizations will be used in neighboring countries, but I think that these organizations are going to start killing each other as well. I think it's going to be a messy few months ahead. I think the United States and its allies will try to be using these groups to carry out terror attacks, but it also has blowback, because the more unstable our region becomes, the more refugees go to Europe. And this is not in the interest of Europe. But Europe and the United States have a tradition of sacrificing their own interests for the sake of the Israeli regime. But these groups will cause another type of blowback, and that is they will make Russia move away from Turkey. They will make China move away from Turkey. They'll make Central Asian countries more cautious about Turkey. So those countries that are supporting the terrorists, there will be a burden, as I said, but that we should also include the international aspect of this. These groups will be at each other's throats, I believe. I'm not saying that they will all be fighting one another, but it's going to be very difficult. I don't think they're going to be able to systematically be organized systematically to go after Iraq. And also the difference between Iraq today and the first time round when ISIS invaded Iraq is that today Iraq has a much stronger military. The Hashid, or the Popular Mobilization Forces, they have the ability to hit back hard. And if indeed Assad was able to stand firm and the army was in place, they would have been able to help hold back ISIS and al-Qaeda. But that, as we discussed earlier, was not to be. So I don't think it will be very easy for them. They can create unrest in Iraq, and that's dangerous for the West, by the way, for the world, because Iraq is a major oil producer now. And someone said to me that, well, the United States produces its own oil. True, but if the price of oil goes up to $300 a barrel or $200 a barrel, for ordinary Americans, it's going to go up the same price as well. So the people who are producing the oil may be making more money in the United States, but ordinary Americans are going to have to pay a lot more money for their gasoline, for their electric bills, and so on. So these terror organizations, if they're used as tools, they could cause damage. But I do think that they will have a lot of problems, and they'll be fighting with the Kurds. Iraq is a powerful country, relatively speaking. I think the big question is what will happen between the United States and Iran. That is the real, because Iran will strike at Israel. It will happen. I think it's not far off. I don't have any information, but I think it will happen during the Biden presidency. But even if the Israeli regime strikes back and Iran strikes again, for Iran, that's not a big deal. The main question is, will the United States get involved militarily? If it does, then those countries, or those mini states in the Persian Gulf region, those family dictatorships, they will be seen as aggressors because Americans have bases in these countries, and therefore their infrastructure will be fair game. And that means the oil and gas facilities will be destroyed. And Iran has hundreds of thousands of drones and hundreds of thousands of short and medium range missiles. The long range missiles are for Israel, the Israeli regime, but the short range missiles, I mean, the Persian Gulf is not very wide, and it's pretty long, and Iran owns one side of it. That's why it's called the Persian Gulf. So they can easily destroy all through their underground missile sites, all of these oil and gas installations and the tankers. They don't need to even shut down the Strait of Hormuz. There won't be anything to get through the Strait of Hormuz, whether it's open or closed. So that would create a global economic meltdown. That would be catastrophic for the world. And I think there are enough sane people in Washington to recognize that. So in a sense, there's a balance of terror between Iran and the United States. But Washington is full of crazy people too. So we can't be certain about anything.
And it sounds like the United States has created a monster that at some point they're going to be unable to tame, is what you're coming at. And we're already going to start seeing the ramifications of that moving forward. Dr. Marandi, I would love to continue this conversation, but I think we both have to cut it short now. But we will have you on again soon to talk more about U.S.-Iranian relations moving forward, and also what all of this means in terms of BRICS and China relations, as you mentioned. We didn't even get to that, get that far deep into that, but that is definitely going to be the next part of our conversation. Thank you so much for joining us today, and hopefully we'll have you on again soon.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been a pleasure.